Good feeling.
I think we should go ahead and get started. And happy Mother's Day to the mothers on the call, and happy sixth Sunday of Easter. And we're delighted to welcome Dr. Eric Elnes. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah.
Eric is a scholar with a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, and until recently was the senior minister of a community church in Omaha that served as a Christian partner of a Interfaith initiative with a community synagogue and a mosque sharing a 38 acres commons. And so he has lived and is going to share with us this morning some of his experience of building interfaith community. He's a videocaster and a podcaster and author. And Eric, we're delighted you're here and look forward to the wisdom that you have to share with us.
Thank you. And once again, thank you for actually inviting me back after the no-show last week. I was right on. I thought I was early, and then I got the message like, oh, we're just finishing up. Like, what? Got the time wrong. So thank you for your patience with me. I really appreciate that. The big kind of interfaith dialogue piece in my life, besides the fact that I've been focusing on pluralism for the last 26 years of my 26-year ministry, was happened in Omaha, which I just moved from, and the Interfaith initiative in Omaha. And partly as a result of that Interfaith initiative, I like to call myself a Jewish Christian Muslim. And by that I mean, I'm Jewish in the sense that I believe that Jesus was really simply trying to make help us all become better Jews, and Christian, of course, because I'm a follower of Jesus, and Muslim with a small m, not a large m. Muslim literally means one who submits to God, and so we should all probably be Muslim with a small m, but those who submit to God according to the strictures of Muhammad, that would be Muslim with a capital M. But before kind of getting into the Interfaith, I actually would like to step back in history to provide a little context, and actually to a philosopher and physicist, mathematician named Charles Babbage, who lived in the mid-1800s. And in 1860, he came up with a prototype for this really unusual machine which he called the difference engine. And the machine was actually not built. And so he, in 1861, with the help of another mathematician named Ada Lovelace, he came up with a more complex version of this machine and had it, but that was never built either. Had it been built, it would have been about 8 feet tall, had 25,000 moving parts, and weighed 15 tons. Now, this difference engine eventually was built about 130 years later by a group in Great Britain at the Science Museum there. They built this machine, and what it was meant to do was make mathematical calculations. What actually this was the world's first programmable computer. When they built this machine, according to just the manufacturing tolerances of the mid-1800s, it actually worked and was able to make mathematical computations out to the 31st decimal. I mean, this was a highly accurate programmable computer. And you wonder, well, why on earth? I mean, a programmable computer in the 1860s? I mean, why wasn't this ever built? Right? Well, the reason why it was never built is because there was no need for a programmable computer back in the 1860s. I mean, manufacturing tolerances weren't even close to needing something that could calculate something to the 30th decimal point of accuracy. He was a visionary who was way farther ahead of his time. Now, but this machine did become very, very vital in world history, though. During World War II, the Nazis invented a code machine that created codes that were so uncrackable, they gained the name of the Enigma code. And they kept winning victory after victory, and the Allies couldn't solve it. So finally, in Great Britain, the government code and cipher school brought a bunch of people in, and you may have even seen the film about Alan Turing, who invented the world's first programmable, actual working programmable computer, and he had drawn directly on Charles Babbage's work in the 1860s in order to come up with a machine that eventually cracked the code and turned the course of World War II. And you wonder, so what gave rise to finally a programmable computer, even though it had been invented almost a century earlier? Well, again, the world didn't have need for a computer back in the mid 19th century, but it had one heck of a need in the mid 20th century. So that the need itself brought out the technology. And I think about that when I think about Jesus himself. In many ways, he was the Charles Babbage on steroids of the first century. He came out with a lot of ideas that have continued to had immediate influence and have continued to have influence. But also, it seems to me that at the core of his message is something like a difference machine that he trotted out there, and the world has given it lip service for centuries, but never really put it into effect. That is his Sermon on the Mount. Specifically, I'll take myself off of this, where he says this to me is the code of Jesus's machine. You love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, give to anyone who begs from you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. I think that's Jesus's difference engine, and again, we've given lip service to it, and we always say we should love our enemies, but when push comes to shove, we start shoving and pushing. We consider Jesus to be naive. Maybe we don't articulate it that way, but that's certainly the way we act is as if Jesus was really more of an idealistic, naive person to believe in having such extraordinary love that you love those who make you profoundly uncomfortable or even are your enemies. But today, we in our world, his words may have additional resonance. As we face really three primary threats to really human existence, coming together between the possibility of some sort of nuclear catastrophe to global climate change, and either one of these two could wipe humanity off the planet, or at least a significant amount of it. And then, of course, you never know about what technology will stir up next. I remember Jon Stewart a few years ago had Richard Dawkins on his show and The Daily Show, and Jon Stewart said, as much as you're touting science, I have the feeling the end of the world the last words ever entered at the end of the world might be from a scientist who said, "Oh, that worked." But really, we're facing in this century some pretty strong existential threats to literally the existence of humanity, stronger existential threats than we've ever faced in the history of humanity. And so we definitely have a need for a new difference engine. So maybe it's a love engine that Jesus created. And really, if you think about it, if there is a God, and if this God is actually aware of us, maybe even more aware of us than we're aware of us, and because of that awareness, and despite that awareness, loves us all beyond our wildest imagination. Those are three statements that I believe are true. There is a God who is aware of us, who loves us all without exception beyond our wildest imagination. Then one would not expect that such a God at this time period in human history, where we're faced with the greatest existential threats we've ever found, to simply be sitting up there in the heavens looking down saying, "Hey, let me know how that all works out for you." That really the spirit of the living God we would expect to be at work, and long before now even, to help humanity gradually build up to meet some of these greatest threats to our human existence. And to me, that's exactly what has been going on, and it's been building this help, an outpouring of the Holy Spirit for over a century, I think, and just kind of this gradual outpouring and understanding. If you look at this, just look at the 1900s. I mean the 20th century, just from 1900 to 2000, all the amazing changes that took place for human liberation, and really truly from loving people who make us uncomfortable, and actually put into effect. In the year 1900, there were 200 countries that had some form of legalized slavery or forced labor. By the year 2000, there were just 3 countries in the world who had forced labor. If you look at 1900, in 1900, just 1 country allowed women to vote in the world. By 2017, there are 200 countries. If you look at child mortality, in 1900, a full 40% of all children died before the age of 5. And while any death of any child is an incomprehensible tragedy, the fact that it's gone down to 4% from 40, it has really huge effects on people's lives. And this is all from people who actually gave a rip about trying to solve some of the world's hurts, and not do a morality test on who they're going to apply that technology to. You look at 1900, only 20% of the world was literate, and now it's closer to 90%. In 1900, only 15% of the population of the world lived in a democracy, and now it's about 60%. Whereas Nicholas Kristof at the New York Times reminds us too, with the exception of last year, which was the pandemic, over the last decade, an average of over 200,000 people per day were liberated from extreme poverty, defined as earning less than $2 per day, according to the World Data Bank. Over 200,000 per day emerged from extreme poverty. Over 300,000 people per day in the last decade gained access for the first time to electricity. 300,000 people per day gained access to clean drinking water. 650,000 people per day in the last 5 years have gained access to the internet. No, it seems that no matter where you look, and we can go on and on, whether it be race, gender, LGBTQ equality, poverty, education, health, and interfaith efforts, this real commitment to loving those who make us uncomfortable, even our enemies, has really been bearing itself out and created changes that, on the magnitude, make the Great Renaissance, in Europe 5 centuries ago, look like child's play in terms of magnitude of change and for the betterment of human society. Which gives me some reason for optimism, and part of that reason for optimism was very much lived out in that interfaith context, in Omaha, Nebraska. In Omaha, on 9/11, 2001, there was a rabbi named Rabbi Aryeh Osrael, who was prescient enough to know that that probably on 9/11 that the Muslim community probably needed some protection, ground support. And so he called on leaders from his congregation to walk down to the mosque that was close to them and stand outside it shoulder to shoulder to protect the mosque, and then called on other community leaders who joined them. Well, you can imagine the effect that had on that Muslim community in Omaha. It really, here you had this Jewish community, Muslims, and obviously in recent years, Jews and Muslims haven't exactly been loving neighbors. And yet this really sparked really a relationship that became more and more beautiful over time, and a greater relationship between that synagogue and the mosque, to the point where several years later, both communities, for different reasons, wanted to move west in Omaha. And they realized that if they could find land that would accomplish, where they could both build, they could share a parking lot and save a lot of money on a shared parking lot. And that's literally the origin of the Tri-Faith Initiative, was just simply to save money on a parking lot between a synagogue and a mosque. But it wasn't too long after that idea popped out that one of the leaders from Temple Israel realized that, hey, if we get the Christians involved, we can do a lot more than save some money on a parking lot. And hence, the Tri-Faith Initiative was really born. And it took a while to get off the ground, and they had to find a Christian partner. They approached the Catholic Church at first, but they were turned down and pretty abruptly. And then the Episcopal Church became the Christian partner in that initiative. But for as opposed to the other two faith communities, the Episcopal Church didn't have a community that was already thriving, who simply wanted to co-locate to a shared campus. And so they just kind of tried to build the Church of the Tri-Faith, but it was years before they even found the appropriate property, and then they had bishop transition. So anyway, long and short of it is they never really got a congregation off the ground. And so in 2015, they approached the Tri-Faith Initiative. The bishop of the Episcopal Church approached Countryside, my church, and one thing led to another, and we eventually became the Christian partner in the Tri-Faith Initiative, which was rather extraordinary, really, because Countryside is a 1,300 member church. We were in a neighborhood for 65 years that we loved, and in a building that we all loved, nobody wanted to move from. And so, here you have this proposition to move from a neighborhood you don't want to move from, from a building you don't want to move out of, and then charge yourself millions and millions of dollars for the privilege of doing that in order to rebuild on a campus that was just 6 miles from us. But that's exactly what Countryside did. After a 40-day period of discernment, where we asked every question we could possibly ask about the Tri-Faith Initiative, except for one question, which was how much would it cost us to move. We decided that we felt it was God's will that we take the discernment to the next level and ask, can we find resources to do that? And I was really glad in that 40-day period of discernment that we didn't ask how much it would cost, because that's a really great way to really fog up discernment. If you think that you can't afford it, of course, then you don't really take it seriously. On the other hand, if somebody just says, "Hey, I'll write a check for whatever it costs," you might just say yes without really truly discerning. And we figured that even if somebody could write a check like that, if it wasn't God's will that we go, why would we want to? But even if we couldn't find them, even if the money seemed intimidating, if it is God's will, then we figured that resources would come, and so we voted overwhelmingly to go on that search. And when we added up the figures, it was going to be $26 million to build a church on on the Tri-Faith Commons, and that intimidated even me. And yet, within 2 years, we moved on to the Tri-Faith Commons, into this $26 million building, debt-free, and that's from entirely local money. I mean, I think maybe a couple $100. It was not from Omaha of the 26 million. It was really, really extraordinary. And I'll just give you a little walkthrough of the campus. It's a 35-acre commons, and the purpose of even getting together like this is to move beyond interfaith dialogue and to interfaith relationship. That's the bottom line. Is actually let's be in each other's faces regularly. So we built 3 separate, worship facilities, and offices and so forth, and then also a common center called the Tri-Faith Center. And then in the very middle of the property is a bridge called Abraham's Bridge, and it's a circle, and it's a pretty dramatic bridge. It's a 1/4 mile around, and the reason why we wanted to make it dramatic is because, the 35-acre commons is actually on a former golf course that in the 20s was a Jewish country club when it was built when Omaha didn't allow Jews into other country clubs, and later became a public course, privately, but it wasn't a country club. And then later the Tri-Faith bought it. But in the middle of the property, a creek runs through called Hell's Creek. Believe it or not, Hell's Creek. And we thought it was because so many people got their golf balls, stuck in the water, but it turns out it was named that before the golf course area. but in order to bring the synagogue that on one side of the property and the other two faith communities on the other side of the creek together, we literally had to bridge hell. And we thought, well, if we're going to bridge hell, let's do it in the most dramatic way possible. And so that's what led to Abraham's Bridge. So I'm going to take you on a little walk around Abraham's Bridge so you can see what it looks like. That's the campus in a nutshell. And what I can say from moving on to the campus and being there for the first year and a half that we were all there together, it was one of the more transformative experiences of my life and also in the life of the congregation. There's a huge difference between just kind of engaging in interfaith dialogue once in a while and seeing your interfaith neighbors, most days of the week. Or at least regularly. And for me, a big change also was not just through the dialogue, but about two weeks of every month, I would start my weekend on Friday worshiping in the mosque, and then Saturday worshiping in the synagogue at their Shabbat service, and then Sunday at my church. And to have the privilege of being able to enter those two faith communities and be treated, as just another one of them, and to actually worship alongside them is something that just I just can't really articulate in words adequately just how profound that is and just how much that adds to a person's knowledge and understanding of people. You can dialogue all you want, but you start worshiping with them, and takes everything to a whole another level. Our church eventually actually hired Rabbi Aryeh Oswell when he retired from the synagogue. He became our rabbi in residence, and so he had an office right next to mine, and to this day teaches every Monday morning Judaism, class on Judaism for the countryside community, and he always got more people than I could even get to a class. His classes are just packed with people, and we've regularly had the clergy and others preach at our church, and we preach for them, shared and lots of shared meals. We have a Taste of Tri-Faith every year where everybody brings their holiday foods. And shares them around. We have all kinds of events like that, or showing up for Ramadan or for like Eid. We would bring dates to the Muslim community, like the Jewish and Christian community would, when they break their Ramadan fast, would show up with the traditional dates that break the fast, or when or we show up with apples and honey when during the high holidays for the Jewish community. They show up for us at Christmas time, passing out candy canes after people leave our Christmas services, and doing other educational events like we've done. For a while, we were doing something called a rabbi, a minister, and an imam walk into a bar, and or more than a joke. And we would do. We literally held it in a bar for a while. Then we kind of realized, well, the Muslims aren't wild about going to bars necessarily, so we changed it to coffee house, and then eventually to just the Tri-Faith Commons, but where people could get together and we would talk about any subject of faith and from a Tri-Faith perspective. And incidentally, there's actually a set of podcasts that were recorded just before the pandemic, and then that were Jesus's parables, 6 of Jesus's parables that focus on creation, and having an imam and a rabbi and myself comment on those parables. And that you can find if you go to the Darkwood Brew website, or just go to any podcast, you go to Podbean or any Apple podcasts, just type in Converging Paths podcast. Those are just now being released. Today was the first release of the first one. of 6, and there'll be one released every week. And that's just a fascinating conversation. It's amazing what happens when a Jew and a Muslim sit down and help you understand the parables that you've heard all your life that you thought you understood pretty well, and discover all kinds of nuances to them in depth that just never even occurred. And that's, I think, one of the most greatest pieces of the Tri-Faith Initiative for me is that people actually, before the Tri-Faith Initiatives, before we moved there, would ask, what's Countryside's interest in this? And I would joke with them a bit, saying the best interest of Countryside is that the average Countrysider will become 20% more Christian as a result. And what I meant by that was not we look at the other communities and say, oh, thank God I'm Christian, not them, but rather we would actually discover the common ground that we share. And also, though we learn to appreciate the differences we have as well. And it's kind of like going to a foreign country. If you go to a country that's very different from your own, you get a lot of great ideas. You think, oh, wow, I want to incorporate these ideas in my everyday life. But you also realize just how precious your own world that you left behind was. And you appreciate that more than ever. And that absolutely took place throughout the congregation very quickly. People did really seriously become more Christian. And I would say we all became a little more Muslim and Jewish at the same time as well. It's amazing. To me, it's almost like 3 children of the same parent. As children, we all want to believe that we're the apple of our parents' eyes. We're the only. We're the greatest. But when we stop bickering and actually start to just get to know one another and play with one another and share with one another and protect one another, you discover that each one of these children is very precious in the parent's eyes, and each one has a different way of relating to the parent and has insights about the parent that you didn't necessarily have too. And so your own relationship with your parent becomes much greater and deeper and frankly more joyous when you stop believing that you're the only kid on the block or only kid in the family that matters at all. So I want to finish and I'll take any questions, but this is a video that was created by the Tri-Faith Initiative just as we were about to open that kind of articulates more than just my feelings about the Tri-Faith.
To learn how to deal with stuff that people feel similar to us and people feel different. To do something that is outrageous. Right? Conflict is the opportunity to change the landscape of religious life in the 21st century. Traffic the change that we will see in the response of the poor for the 3 children of Abraham to come back together and effort to pass the co-located satisfaction and raising profit and humbleness. For me, is just a sensible thing to do. You can't really religious groups together that have traditionally had for a circle around the month area to learn to protect the barrier. You realize that we shouldn't just come together and hardship that's on our side. We should come together in everyday life. We should be part of one another's lives and really put on play. And the only way to really do that is to come locally. Very important is the American Muslim Institute and Countryside Community Church here for a common campus. We're communities who believe very different things. We look at the same God, but we see very different expressions. Who historically said because of those differences, we can't get along. It's 3 faiths coming together, not to blend faiths or to dilute who we are as individual communities. To show that these 3 faiths have more things in common than they have in the first. The most important issue is not changing anyone's mind, but simply an open mind. There will be no persecution. Everyone will be blessed to be careful and beautiful faith. Everyone who has chosen to spend some time
working together on this, getting to know people of the other faith. It's kind of like a better person for it, more grounded in their own faith, better listen to it, and a better human being, a better leader. One of the things that I've made most of in all the time is a true sense of who I am as a group. The idea is for people who are Jewish, people who are Christian, people who are Muslim, we should have this property and get to know one another as neighbors who get to know. And we would hope that those kinds of relationships can foster peace.
The physical nature of Interfaith is a 35-acre property. There are 4 buildings that are on the property, one for each of the faith communities, and then one for the Interfaith community itself. That is envisioned as a welcome center.
And for those that may be hesitant to go to a mosque, go to a synagogue, or go to a church, start at the Interfaith building. I'd like it to be a place where people come to learn. The central iconic portion of the commons will be the bridge. Just like in your own neighborhood where we have streets and walkways that connect one another, the bridge will be that connection point. I would love to see the way that Interfaith is all happening in Europe and the East. South Asia. Doesn't matter. But what's more important than that is to see people together.
When we make statements like, oh, we should import companies, you talk about religion and politics, I think what we're saying is when we can't have rich relationships that are real,
Diversity is not a problem, it's an actual goal. And all of us in our speeches, in our holy writings, have difficult points. This is what I want to start a conversation. It's not an issue that we have disagreements, how do we work together to really those disagreements.
We're going to set a model, we live by example, in a way that I told them when we say, oh yeah, why would we do this?
It's not.
you are individuals, you are individuals, so they're neighbors.
Being multi-ethnic is really revolutionary, but I hope it's not, because it's normal, because getting along with other people is natural and normal. Extraordinary to people of the Islamic and very early. I think they're way more for this, so they can meet people, very conference.
This meeting is going to bring that information to us, to our kids, so they can grow up to be able to maintain not just for Christians and Protestants. They have to work together and for their and for all the faiths for that.
I was always really to become light to the world. I wanted to become this hero to the world. People are getting to know each other and building respect and even trust. And if we can have dozens and hundreds and eventually thousands of those relationships, that's really the biggest success. When we get to the stage when it says ever I find peace, and we're like, well, shoot, we're finding peace in all harm. But that's maybe there's hope for us that we will listen, be the peacemaker, and we got this holy peoples. Advancing this spirit.
So that's a little bit about the Tri-Faith. What questions might you have? Or anything you'd like to talk about based on what you've seen?
I'll kick off, or go ahead, Michael. You go first.
I was just going to say, earlier you mentioned a website and podcasts that are available through that website. Could you tell us more about the website and what resources are there for us if we want
Yeah.
to learn more?
You bet. Let me, I can pull that up, show you the website too. So this is darkwoodbrew.org. And if you go to that, the website is actually, this is a, Darkwood Brew is a internet television program that we produced for 5 years at Countryside to provide churches with small group video resources. But if you go to this little tab that says On Tap, you'll find you don't have to have a subscription. This is a subscription website, but you don't have to have a subscription to get to these podcasts. Converging Paths this is its 31st episode that was just posted, but the 31st episode is the first of 6 episodes that deal with it's a part of the series called Earthly Wisdom, where you get these conversations, these tri-faith conversations. But again, you can find the podcast through any podcast aggregator, Podbean or Apple Podcasts, whatever. Just type in Converging Paths, you'll find it.
Thank you.
Pleasure. And if you want some real great small group video resources, that Darkwood Brew site has 28 different series between 6 and 8 parts each that make it super easy for a layperson to lead just the most engaging small group experience you could ever have.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, you're muted, Ann.
I'm wondering what sort of interfaith activities we have here in this area. I know there was a council in Stamford at one time. Also, many of you may remember Bill Sachs. I don't know if you've heard of him, Eric, but he was a minister here for a while and started the Interfaith Community for Reconciliation at his church in Richmond after he left, and has, I think, told us a little bit about that. So it seems like your situation is the best I can imagine because you see each other all the time and it's more natural. But anyway, so I'm just wondering what we have in our area that goes toward interfaith activities, if any of you know.
I know one, sort of.
Yeah.
The New York Disaster Interfaith Services, based in New York, which Peter Goditis, our former youth minister, is the CEO of. And they are an interfaith disaster relief organization.
Yeah, there's so much good interfaith work going on right now. Tri-faith is just kind of like a tip of an iceberg of amazing things. There's something in Stony Brook, New York, too, where I think there's about 20 or 30 Christians, Jews, and Muslims who have committed to living together. Literally, they moved and they have apartments there and doing that. There's another kind of tri-faith community that was inspired by the Omaha tri-faith that it's trying to get established in Berlin, Germany, called House of One, where they're actually building a building, and then each of the faiths are in the same building, but they have separate worship services. And there was just about a year or so ago a tri-faith campus that's being proposed and built by the Catholic Church, and it's in Abu Dhabi, I think, or someplace in the Middle East. That there was one that's starting, but before these, you have to go back about 800 years before you find an example of Jews, Christians, and Muslims intentionally, moving into proximity of one another. So,
Eric, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but one of the things that was a real blessing to me in a previous phase of life was a practice called scriptural reasoning, which came out of the University of Cambridge. And the idea was to gather Christian, Jewish, and Muslim people of faith, of sort of both professional and otherwise, for regular readings of scripture together of one another's texts.
Nice.
So it wasn't quite the living alongside that you had the amazing experience of, but it was very powerful.
Wow, bet. Yeah.
I wonder, you've now moved
Yeah.
into a new context, and I wonder kind of where the Spirit is leading you in that work, and what it's like to step out of it, having been part of it. That must be a loss.
Yeah, it's of course moving during just 6 months ago during a pandemic. It's everything's happened a little slower, but I already have my new rabbi BFF. I did not waste time finding a rabbi I get together with regularly, and then and as things open up, I'm hoping to find a relationship with fellow Muslims and others. My own congregation this congregation here in Portland has a history of interfaith openness and engagement, and a number of people in our congregation are married to people of different faiths. And so that was part of their attraction to bringing me here, was that background. So we'll see where it all leads. But already the tri-faith experience is influencing different in ways that are even indirect, or they're very direct, but they're not necessarily obvious. Like after the pandemic, we are literally talking about going through a 2 or 3 month nomadic period as a congregation, where we will gather physically on the second Sunday of every month and really make a big deal of it, the great morning and potluck and all this afterwards. But on the other Sundays, for the first 2 or 3 months, we will worship in congregations that are predominantly Black, Indigenous, or people of color. With all of the racial kind of upheaval during the pandemic, and it's very much in Portland, we thought maybe we should put our bodies where our minds and hearts are, and say, as a predominantly white congregation, we need to shut up and listen a bit, and actually allow other communities who are not us help influence our own future direction. And that insight about going to actually worship with them, really came directly from my own experience with the Tri-Faith. It's like you can dialogue, but nothing replaces actually being in a worship environment with people who you're in conversation with. There's ways of understanding that you just can't get in any other way. Michael?
What's the name of your church in Portland? We have dear friends in Portland, and we want to send them over to see you.
Oh, wonderful. It's a First Congregational United Church of Christ, fcucc.com. Our website is uccportland.org.
Thank you.
We have Zoom worship on at 10:30 on Sundays right now. 10:30 Pacific, that is. Yeah. But Ryan, your experience of those interfaith conversations on Scripture, I think that I just resonate so much with that. I know, to be able to even take a concept like that we're all so familiar with, like love your neighbor. Okay, well, you don't get more Jesus-y than love your neighbor. Of course, we also know that Jesus drew from the Hebrew Scriptures for that line. But you ask, I remember one time I asked one of my rabbi friends and one of my Muslim friends, what does loving your neighbor mean to you? And my Muslim friend, Jamal Daoudi, who you saw on the video, he said, well, Muhammad made it very clear. He was asked, who is my neighbor? And he said, you count 40 houses this direction, 40 houses that direction, 40 houses this direction, 40 houses that direction. They are your neighbors. You must take care of them. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh my gosh, what a concrete way. These Christians, we kind of think, well, everybody's my neighbor. Anybody who's hurting is my neighbor. And so we try to be all things to all people, and we get exhausted. But what a just great concrete way is like, oh my gosh, how many of my neighbors do I know that are in 40 houses this direction, that direction, this direction, this direction? It really got me thinking about that, and it actually led to me developing deeper relationships with my own neighbors, and trying to find needs in my own neighborhood that weren't being met. And then the rabbi talked about the mitzvah, that every day you are commanded to kind of go above and beyond to do something helpful for someone else. And when he said that, it reminded me back when I lived in New Jersey and I was serving this little tiny congregation while I was working on my dissertation at Princeton. That there was a Jewish couple that liked to come, because I used to my degrees in the Hebrew Scriptures, and so I tell a lot of Old Testament things. And they'd come, and one day though, my car, it broke down, and I needed to, and I would live 45 minutes from my house. And so I would, when they learned of this, the couple said, well, we'll take you home. I'm like, oh no, I mean, this is 45 minutes, oh no, but they said, no, you'll actually help us, because they told me about this thing called a mitzvah. And it's like, we haven't done our mitzvah today, so you're actually helping us if you would accept the ride. And it's like, okay, but it was just this amazingly guilt, way of relieving the guilt of somebody who's being helped, and so it just, those things just start to nuance, and so I started thinking more, once the rabbi mentioned this about the neighbor, reminded me of this, I started asking myself, have I done a mitzvah today? And maybe I'd have better, since it's easy to forget, maybe I ought to intentionally plan, who am I going to help today, and above and beyond. And so it's made me a better neighbor, just a simple observation from a Jew and a Muslim about that.
I think maybe we have time for another question if folks have one.
I'd be happy to address a question that many people have, but not everybody asks.
Go for it.
Which is, if Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes unto the Father except through me, isn't Christianity the only game on the planet? And and that's not necessarily a question that more mainline congregations ask, but it is kind of a question mainline congregations ask, maybe not as urgently as evangelical or fundamentalist congregations. And I've become convinced that well, first of all, those words come from the Gospel of John, which is the least historical gospel, but I'm going to take it at face value that Jesus spoke those words. And what I get from them is not that Christianity is that Jesus was not speaking about Christianity itself. Of course, there was no term Christianity even back then. He was really talking about a way of life. It's kind of like when Jesus says, "Whatsoever you ask in my name, you'll receive." If that was true, if I could just simply say, Jesus, God, I pray in the name of Jesus, I want this. Every book I wrote would be a New York Times bestseller, and every sermon I preached would have the whole congregation just rolling in the aisles like in ecstasy and so forth. But that doesn't work, right? Because he's not talking about his name. He's really talking about, in ancient times, the name is a signification of one's essence, the will. If you ask according to what my essence is, what I would will, you receive it. And the same thing when it says that I am the way, the truth, and the life. He's talking about a way of life that connects us to God. And so he's not just simply saying anything goes. There's a specific way of life he's referring to. And in the Gospels, he makes it clear what that is. When he's asked, what's the most important thing to know of all, he says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And he said, there's another commandment like it, love your neighbor as yourself. It's these three great loves, the love of God, love neighbor, and the one that oftentimes drops out of the equation, love of self. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. So you don't love yourself, please don't love me like you love yourself, right? But those three that always must be practiced organically together, where you don't say, well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, so I'll love God and me, but not my neighbor, or I'll love God and my neighbor, not me. They all have to be practiced organically. That is a way of life that was central to Jesus's life and ministry and teaching, and his death and resurrection, I would say. And I would add, so I call them the 3 G's, but for great loves. But I think Jesus added another great G, a 4th G, which is grace. That understanding that even though we're supposed to practice the 3 G's in concert with one another organically, we never quite do that, do we? Like we should. And so we need God's grace to cover for our imperfections. We need God's vision to cover for our lack of vision. We need God's generosity to cover for our lack of generosity, these kinds of things. And so if you can't give or receive grace, lots of luck connecting with God, just as if you can't, love your neighbor, lots of luck connecting with God. But if you have these 4 G's coming together, love of God, neighbor, self, and grace, I think that's exactly the way of life that Jesus really was meant to connects us with the divine. And that's certainly a way of life that can be found in these other 2 Abrahamic faiths, and I would argue beyond them as well. But it's not just anything goes. but where you find those 4Gs together, you find connectivity with the divine and the possibility of deep relationship across interfaith lines.
As they say, that'll preach. Well, thank you, Eric, so much for being with us and waking up early. I hope you have a good Zoom service in an hour or so, and really appreciate the story you shared with us and the inspiration it gives us.
Well, thank you for your grace and forgiveness about last week, and happy Mother's Day to you. And if you're ever in Portland, do stop by and visit.
And when you're back in Darien, come say hi.
Will do. That's a deal.
Sounds good.
All right.
Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Much.
All right.